I want to take you to Jesus' testimony. Go to Matthew 4 with me. And I'm only going to show you one word of Christ's temptation. And then we're going to go to his sermon on temptation. But Matthew chapter 4, and maybe you've never noticed this before. I really hadn't. The very first word Jesus speaks in Matthew 4, remember that's his temptation. He was in all points tempted like as we are. Jesus was tempted to fulfill a legitimate desire in an illegitimate way. That's exactly what David was tempted to do. David had a legitimate desire. He had sexual desire. He was tempted to fulfill it illegitimately, to grab someone that wasn't his wife, that he saw and was tempted by over the rooftop. And he chose to fulfill a legitimate desire in an illegitimate way. Jesus chose not to. He was tempted in all points like as we are. But notice the first thing that Jesus says, the very first words of Jesus in his temptation, Matthew 4 and verse 4. But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live." Do you know what Jesus was saying by that? He didn't say God. He quotes a verse about man. You know what the dynamic is of the temptation? That Jesus overcame Satan as a man. He was operating with the same rules and power and abilities that we have afforded us by God as humans. Jesus' first reference, he said, Bible says, man. Man, that's what I am. And that's how I'm defeating you, devil. I'm not doing this as God. I'm doing this as man. Well, what are we supposed to do? Turn over the next page, chapter 5. Because I love Christ's message. It's so sobering. Matthew 5. We need to be doing what it takes to maintain purity in our lives. We need to not relax our grip. We live in an age where impurity is becoming a tidal wave around us. We know how the end is going to be. It says, and everyone is either lawless or licentious. By the time of Christ's return in the tribulation time, everyone is given over to immorality and to lawless living and to demonic pursuits and everything else. We know that's coming. As we're on the way, it's getting more and more pronounced. Jesus says in Matthew 5, that we need to be serious about sexual sin. I've told you before, every time sin lists are mentioned in the New Testament, every time Paul or one of the other apostles addresses the church and tells them what to be aware of, sexual sin is always at the top of the list. It's not an accident. It is the first place that there is usually a grievous sin in a congregation. Now, there seems to be a lot of sins that are down here that are, the normal insecurities and fears and things like that. But the Lord treats those differently. He says if you sin in a sexual sin, you sin against your own body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit. There seems to be an added weight to sinning against this temple in sexual sins. So Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, some words that often we look as hyperbole. We look at them as overkill. Kind of like Jesus, come on, don't get overboard. Don't get worked up about that. He talks about sexual sin like he talks about no other kind of sin. And I want to remind you of that. And we should read Christ's words again and ponder them personally, because he said something that we don't hear very often. In fact, just as a sidelight, this morning when I got done speaking, a visitor came up to me and said, I looked at the church page and I looked at the churches and I thought, I don't want to go to a church where they don't preach from the Bible. So this person said, they bowed their head and they said, Lord, I want to go to a church where I'll hear the Bible this morning. And they said, there's one that isn't even in the church page. We ought to try that one, that Tulsa Bible Church. And they came up to the front at the end and said, thanks for saying something I bet nobody else would dare say in Tulsa this morning. Do you know why? Look at verse 37. It's something that is just so hard to take. Jesus says this, Matthew 5:37. You've heard it was said, don't commit adultery. But I tell you, he says, the Old Testament law just said don't commit adultery, but I am going to amplify that. Jesus said, I'm going to tell you that you are conveniently thinking, hey, that's not on my list. That's not a problem I have. And that's where we settle in. We think, hey, that's not something I struggle with. But the Lord says, look at this. I tell you, anyone who looks with desire, which that word lustfully, that has a consuming desire. Anyone who looks with consuming desire at a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. David's sin began on the rooftop, not in the bedroom. It began with his intentional look of lust. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Look, this is where he really gets into the hyperbole. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. And I told you how much they needed for sighting, in battle, for their work, and everything else. Their right eye is so important. It even disorients us today with all of our wonderful conveniences. If there's any lack, there's an impairment. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Which must have caused much, being aghast out there in the crowd that was listening. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, why is Jesus being so radical? I began this morning. Let me finish it tonight. Why does Jesus paint this shocking picture? I believe it's because he wants us to take radical steps. He's saying, do whatever is necessary to not have yourself constantly exposed to sexual temptation. Now, Paul says it doesn't mean moving out of the world. If we want to stay completely away, we'd have to move out of the world. I'm not talking about going to live in Kathmandu where it's too cold and, everybody, there would be no sexual temptation because they're all frozen up there in the Himalayas. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how to operate in everyday life. Paul was working with people who lived in the Roman world. I just shared with my Tuesday morning Bible study some of the little things you pick up when you travel over there. If you've ever been over there, it was very blatant, the sexual temptation of the first century. But how do we deal with it in the 21st century? Well, first of all, when Jesus says in verses 27 to 30 about your hand and your eye, that my hand is not the cause of sin and neither is my eye. Those things do not have a will of their own. They're connected to my will, to my brain, to my choices, to my facilities, and all of my moral choices. So it's not the hand and eye that need to be cut off or gotten rid of. A blind man can still lust, and someone with no hands can still steal. But the eye is a means of access for both godly and ungodly input, and the hand is a means of performing righteous or sinful acts. We must therefore govern by choice what our eye looks at and what our hands do. That's what he's saying. He's saying, cut off any use of the hands or the eye, or of any other part of the body for that matter, that causes sexual sin. If we take Jesus seriously, we need to think far more radically about sexual purity in our very impure world. And I think we should take him seriously. The battle is too intense. The stakes are too high to approach purity casually or gradually. Some fall into mental adultery through the myriad of things that are out in the world. So what do we do about it? We learn to stop looking. We learn to stop putting ourselves in a position to look. If you have to get rid of your TV to guard your purity, Jesus says do it. That's an example of gouging out the eye and cutting off the hand. That is radical. And yet, I know of one person who decided they would raise their family with no television set in the home. His name is R. Kent Hughes, one of my favorite commentators, written a whole shelf of books. You know where he lived when he decided that? He lived in Southern California. They were probably the only home. That's why it says in the national statistics, 99.9% of all homes have televisions. It was probably Kent Hughes' home that was the one that didn't, because he lived in the heartbeat of Southern California. But he said, I want to be radical. I want to not have my children babysat by a sewer hose into my home. And he chose to raise his kids all the way till they went to college with no television set. And he didn't keep it in his bedroom so he could keep up on stuff. He chose himself to not watch television. What a radical thought. If it means you can't go to games because of how the dancers or cheerleaders dress and perform, so be it. If it means you have to lower your head and close your eyes, so be it. If you're embarrassed to do it, stay home. Did you know if every Christian started every time the dancing girls at football and basketball things started dancing, lowered their heads and wouldn't look at it, maybe enough people would do that, they would stop the dancing. Or maybe enough Christians would say, why do I have to keep putting my head down for? Why am I even here? Tell your wife about your struggles. Or if you're single, tell a godly friend. If you need to drop the newspaper because of the ads, fine. If you need your wife to go through and pull out offending inserts, fine. Let's look at Romans 13:14, because there's a very clear command that the New Testament writers picked up on. Romans 13:14 is an imperative for us, and this is what Paul records that Jesus Christ wants us to do. Romans 13, the last verse. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ, aorist, middle imperative, and make no provision for the flesh, a second imperative. So what's the imperative? Romans 13:14 instructs us, make no provision for the flesh. Paul is saying, and Jesus right behind him in the Sermon on the Mount, it is sin to deliberately put yourself in a position where you're likely to commit sin. Well, let's talk about that. Choices that we should make. Whether it's walking through the lingerie department, or going to a swimming pool, or the workout room at the athletic club, if it trips you up, stay away from it. Did you know it's better to be overweight than to be lustful? Proverbs describes the loose woman meeting up with a foolish man after dark in Proverbs 7, verses 8 and 9. We should stay away from people, places, and contexts that make sin more likely. You know what I think is fascinating? We have an analyzer of our website. Do you know when the highest traffic is on our website? From 11 o'clock at night till 1 o'clock in the morning. Do you know why? That's when so many people are on the computer. And there's not a lot of profitable stuff done. I'm glad I think they come out of guilt to our website at 11 o'clock. I don't know. But maybe they just want to come to get convicted. But if it's certain bookstores or hangouts, stay away from them. If it's your cable or satellite TV or network TV or old friends from high school or the internet or computers that are your problem, get rid of them. That's what the Sermon on the Mount said. Jesus was talking in supercultural terms, something that transcends the first century. And he says, even if it's something that you need as much as your right hand, even if it's something you need as much as your right eye to have orientation, get rid of whatever causes you to be tempted to the point of indulging in mental or physical sexual impurity. Just say no to whatever is pulling you away from Jesus, is what he's telling us, and what Paul reiterates right here in the last verse of chapter 13 of Romans. Remember, if you want a different outcome, you have to make different choices. That's what he's saying. Make a choice to get rid of whatever offends God and causes us to sin. If you can't be around women wearing swimsuits without looking and lusting, then don't go on vacation where women wear swimsuits. If that means not going water skiing or to your favorite resort, fine. We're not commanded to go water skiing into our favorite resorts. If it means being unable to go on some type of even a Christian-sponsored event, don't go. See, we just blithely go through life and say, I can't help it. Yes, you can. You can say no. Sound drastic? Compare it to gouging out your eye and cutting off your hand. Doesn't that sound drastic? Isn't Jesus saying take drastic measures? But there are hardly any decent TV shows anymore. Well, then stop watching TV. Why don't you read a book or talk to someone? But the newer novels, all these novels that are around today have sex scenes in them. Then read an old novel or find one without those things in it. But I've subscribed to Sports Illustrated for 30 years, and before they had the bad swimsuit issue, then they have it now. So drop your subscription and write a letter and tell them why. Isn't it interesting that you can economically make your voice known? But it's almost impossible to rent a movie today without some offensive language or some immoral situation. Well, there are enough review sites can help you make a good selection. There are also edited movies, if you have to have the movie, where they cut out those things. But suppose there were no decent movies, what then? Well, the Bible never commands us to watch movies. It commands us to guard our hearts. See, we're just carried along with the river of our culture. And I mean, everybody watches movies and everybody watches TV and everybody goes to games and everybody watches the dancing girls that wear less every year. And, it's not just getting shorter. It's going up this way. I mean, what's left? They're going to be like the Romans who performed completely naked at their sports events. That's where we're headed. It's a battle, and a battle gets bloody. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, do whatever it takes to walk in purity. Someone once wrote a daily contract for themselves. I want to read it to you. It says this: are you willing to do whatever is necessary to protect your sexual sobriety? Are you willing to ask God for help? Are you willing to call on others to help? Are you willing to go to a meeting or read literature or set boundaries and not cross them so that you can and I can be what Jesus said we are to radically be, which is pure and to follow after holiness? You might say, but you're talking about withdrawing from the culture. It's too radical. No. Go back with me to Matthew 5, because I want it to be open before you as I read this to you. Matthew 5 is radical. The Sermon on the Mount is radical. Jesus said, if it would keep you, in verse 27, 28, 29, 30, if it would keep you from sexual temptation, you'd be better off poking out your eye and cutting off your hand. That's radical. That's how radical Jesus was. Jesus called his followers to a level that just was unheard of in the ancient world. But that was God's level. Many claim they're serious about purity, but then they say, no way, I'm not going to give up my television. I'm not going to have my wife holding my computer password and checking my records. But followers of Jesus have endured torture and even given their lives to obey him. And we whine about cable? Have you thought about that? That's why when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith? Christians whine about how long the services are and how much is required of them and that they miss television shows because they have to go out on outreach visitation. What are you going to do when they line you up and want to tie you to a post and burn you? See, we whine about the wrong things. And that makes us unprepared to be faithful even to death. When Jesus called us to take up our cross and follow him, which is Matthew 10, it implied sacrifices. And if the most mentioned sin in the New Testament, the head of every single sin list, fornication is either number 1 or number 2 every time anybody talks about sins and lists them off. It's always 1 or 2. And Jesus said fornication is not just physical, it's mental. It starts mentally. That it doesn't happen physically unless the wagons are following the ruts of the mind. And if that's what he said, then we should be willing to sacrifice and forego whatever it takes. How sold out are you to the battle for purity? How desperate are you to have obedience and victory over sin? How radical are you willing to get for your Lord? How much do you want the joy and peace that can only be found in him? That's what Matthew 5, 27 through 30 is all about. Jesus says, stop the enticement and stop the involvement. Whether you're at the involvement level, stop. If you're at the enticement level, stop before you get involved. Purity comes only to those who truly want it. For David, that desire came too late. Will it come too late for you?